towards the edges or in front of a pillar, and you'll be immune from the internet, and that is perfectly fine. So welcome to St. Matthew's Church. My name is Joe, and I'm the curate here. Our rector, Jim, is knocking about somewhere. He's the other person in a collar. There he is. And welcome to this, our Ecotheology evening entitled Ecotheology Missional Activity. Tonight we are very privileged to have Steve Hollinghurst coming to speak to us. Steve is very highly qualified in this field and is the diocesan evangelism enabler. That's correct, right? With a focus on, what's the specific focus? Environmental focus, there we go. So we got the man for the job, I think, tonight to come and speak to us. A couple of housekeeping things before we make a start. You may have already found them. The loos are at the back right, just past where the coffee bar is. And if there's a fire, go out the door where you came in. We're not anticipating any fires or any fire drills, but follow instructions and get out the building. Also tonight, we have Eden's Way have got a stall set up next to the coffee station, and that is Kat is running that store, and Kat is a local pioneer in zero waste produce. So please do take some time to go over there, talk to Kat, see what's on offer, and spend all of your money. And next to that is our fair trade stall run by David and Penny, and that is along a similar line, fair trade products, ethically sourced products. There we go. So the kind of running order for this evening is Steve is going to come and talk to us in a moment for 20-25 minutes, and then there will be a break and a chance for you to have some discussions. Now, I know some of you have come with other representatives from your church. You might like to talk to them, or you might like to go and talk to somebody from a different church or organization to see how they're doing things. Or if you're more of an introvert or an internal processor, feel free to sit by yourself and have a good think. And after that, there will be, and also during that time, there'll be opportunity to get some refreshments as well. And after that, Steve will do the second part of his talk, following which will be some more discussion and then a chance for some questions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Steve up to the stage. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, my title was nicely displayed, so I don't have to tell you what it is, but a little bit of explanation. It's an experimental job that the Diocese have produced within reorganising their mission team. So I work as part of the mission team, and the idea is very much about connecting environmental action and mission and seeing them as connected together, and that will be very much the theme I'm working with this talk. If I could have my presentation up, please, that would be really good. That is great. Okay. And so in a sense, that is what human beings made in God's image are being asked to do. Not sort of be at war with creation, but rather to protect creation from that which would bring destruction and violence within it. Indeed, you could almost imagine it as like being to tend and extend the garden, to use the image of Genesis 2. And when they get thrown out of the garden, you've got this place of thorns and briars. It's like turning everything into paradise is what the human role in creation is about. And that's actually quite an important role. Indeed, the implication of the text is that without humans fulfilling their proper role in creation, creation's harmony balance will never be the flourishing that God intended it to be. But of course, when you get the other side of Eden and relationships are broken between humans and God, humans and each other, and importantly, humans and creation, instead of being the species that protects and tends and nurtures creation, we become its exploiters and harmers. And so actually the work of salvation in stands alone, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. And so the translators kind of try and get it into English and have to put something like, there is a new creation, or something like that. But Paul's understanding of new creation is quite interesting, again, to look at the language in the Greek. Paul, as a Greek, could have chosen one of two words to say new creation. He could have described it as a neokatesis, which would be a creation that was a replacement for the old one. If you imagine you get a new car and you get rid of your old one, you trade it in and you get a new model. That would be the idea of a neokatesis. But that isn't what Paul puts. Paul talks of a kainokatesis, which is actually a renewed car. So it's like if you took your car in and had it done up so it was as good as new and said, that's fabulous, I've got as good a new car. And that is actually consistently the language used in the New Testament, including those texts we showed earlier about, there will be a new creation and it looked like it was going to destroy the old one and start again. That is absolutely not what the Greek tells us. That actually, to use the phrase often used in environmental circles, in God's economy there is no planet B. This is the one that will be renewed. This is the one that remains in God's eternal purpose. This is the one that we will inhabit with all the other children of God for eternity. And that rather changes the complexity of our responsibility towards that planet. And we see in the book of Revelation this mission of God being completed. So here we have Romans 8, as I said earlier, that idea that all the creation are like the children of God. Indeed, it's almost as if when the children of God, as in us, are revealed, then actually the adoption also of every other part of creation can take place. So actually there is this crucial role in us, in a sense, recovering that calling we have in God to be the tenders and nurturers and protectors of creation, for creation itself to thrive. Humans are called, therefore, to be part of this new creation, a part of the renewal of creation. It's an essential part of what it is to be human and an essential part of what it is to follow Christ. And the gospel, in a sense, becomes a proclamation of this vision. And after we've had the break, I'll start saying a bit more about that and how it works. But we are called to proclaim what God is doing in creation. Not just about the transformation of ourselves, though actually if we are not transformed, we will not be the blessing that creation needs us to be. So it starts with us being transformed. But it then spreads out to the transformation of our society and the transformation of the very world we inhabit. Indeed, there's a way of seeing this almost as a priestly calling in creation. One of the things that we learn is not only that Adam is made in the image of God, but Adam comes from Adama, the earth. He is made in the image of the very soil as well. So Adam, and in Adam all of us, connect creation and God and link those two worlds. And there is in Jewish understanding a typology between the Garden of Eden, the temple in Jerusalem, and the throne of God in heaven. And the idea is that the temple becomes a symbol of God's purposes to restore creation. And that's what we see happen in the book of Revelation. And finally here, I think there's a whole thing there of the whole of creation as the people of God. So in Psalm 148, we find the rocks, the stars, the planets, the sun and the moon praising God. And then all the creatures praising God, and lastly, people as well praising God. And this is very much the idea that Tom Wright builds on in his book, How God Became King, talking about the whole of creation as subjects of God's kingdom, along with us, as children of God like us. It's also very much the world of St. Francis, if you know St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures, in which the moon and the sun are brothers and sisters to us, along with water and fire and all the elements of the world. We are God's children with all the elements of creation. And I think also there's this idea, sometimes you hear people talk about thin places, and it's almost like the new creation is breaking through and you can feel it tangibly around you. There's a whole thing here about the Celtic church as well, and saints' wells and things like that, which our country is dotted with. And my understanding is from people who are Welsh speakers, which I am not, the word that's often added to Welsh place names is Llan. So you get Llan followed by the name of a saint. Although rather confusingly, the first letter of the saint's name changes when they do that, so it's hard to spot which saint they're actually talking about unless you're a Welsh speaker. And that is very different to the word for church, which is eglwys. And the idea as it was explained to me is that the Celtic saints understood themselves as converting the very land, not just the people, in their mission. So what are the implications of this for our environmentalism? There is, as I said, no planet B. This is the world that is the theatre of God's work, and we are called to tend to it. The future of creation is dependent, for good or ill, on humanity. It's dependent on us fulfilling our calling. And there is no human extinction plan, therefore, to save the planet. Humans are both fully part of creation, of the soil, but also in the image of God. And we have a responsibility, therefore, that's unique in creation. Indeed, other creatures do not have climate change conferences, and nor do they need to. We do. We have a responsibility in creation that is not held by any other species, but that is not to set us apart as superior, but to simply say we carry a burden of responsibility we are called to fulfill. And what are the implications of this for all sorts of things like our food production, our mineral extraction? What does it mean for all creation to experience the liberty of the children of God? And might we have things to learn from the way indigenous peoples live with the environment around them, which is often far more relational and respectful than the way we have come to live, particularly as we distance ourselves from nature and food production and things like that. And, we go down to the supermarket and don't think too much about where it's come from. So I think there are implications here. Indeed, if one was going to really push the biblical analogy, we should probably all be eating a diet of only fruit and nuts, which is the diet in Genesis. Or is that something for a world to come and not this world? Those are some things you might find it interesting to talk about in our discussion break. So do have a conversation amongst yourselves. Get yourself some teas and coffees. Do have a look at the stalls over there, and we will reform in about, he says, about 20 minutes. Off you go. Oh, we are on now. I'm just giving you a 2-minute warning. Okay, let's take our seats for part 2. We've been looking before the break really at thinking about Christian creation theology in an environmental perspective. We're now going to move on to think about what the implications are for our mission and evangelism. It's a quote I came across recently which I thought was rather apt. Oh, come on, there we go. I used to think that the global environmental problems were biodiversity, loss of ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a transformation that's spiritual and cultural. And us scientists don't know how to do that. Could I have a glass of water? Thank you. Because I fear I have a frog in my throat and it's going to get annoying. Okay. So if the whole of creation is waiting for the children of God to be revealed so it can be set free from bondage to decay, and if this means that humanity is to fulfill its calling in God's image so that it can take responsibility for creation and subdue that which harms it, then what might this transformation of humanity look like? How might we have that greed? Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. How might that transformation be used to overcome that selfishness, greed, and apathy? And quite frankly, this sounds to me like a call to conversion. That's what that scientist is talking about. The need for the world to be converted in order to overcome greed, selfishness, and apathy. Very much like a monastic conversion of life. How might that work out? Well, I think this is where I get into a bit of Anglican communion theology that I find very, very helpful. Very much in the latter part of the 20th century, there was often an argument between people like the World Council of Churches and the World Evangelical Alliance about what the proper place of mission was, with one side talking very much about mission as social action and the other talking about the priority of evangelism. Now that debate has kind of worked its way through, although sometimes you wouldn't know it in our congregations. And there's very strong agreement now in global institutions that mission is a holistic thing that involves all aspects of care and Christian life. And the Anglican Communion expresses it in these 5 marks: to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to seek to transform unjust structures in society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation, and lastly, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. Now, this is a holistic vision, not an either-or vision. Every mark is linked to the other marks. You cannot do one without doing all 4 and 5, following on from it. So the gospel, the good news, is of the kingdom of God, which encompasses a call to all 5 marks. None of the marks can be properly embraced without embracing all of them. And a call to follow Christ and become disciples is essential, therefore, for care and justice for all creation. It's a call to follow Christ, and a call to follow Christ without calling people to care for creation is not actually a call to the gospel of the kingdom. It's a call to something else, something that falls short of the whole message. And indeed, the similar ideas are expressed now by many of the other world churches. This is something that has a common credence, this approach to the understanding of mission and evangelism. Okay, to strive for justice. But the difficulty usually becomes when we start to talk about justice for who and how we're going to do it. This is one of the reasons I sometimes get nervous about the emphasis on the climate crisis. Now, it's very pressing. We desperately need to do something. It is a crisis. But I think if we only think about the climate crisis and not the wider call to care for creation, we can end up perhaps having unintended consequences. So if the focus is entirely on the climate crisis, then clearly the intention is to cut greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane. So we eat local and seasonal, we replace fossil fuels, go to entirely plant-based food production, etc., etc., etc. To tackle climate, that makes sense. But this ignores other issues of maintenance, of food production in relation to nature and local context. There are areas of the world which cannot grow food locally. How are they supposed to eat local? And there is sufficient global inequalities between countries that radically distort the distribution of food. So if climate alone is the perceived issue, we may end up, for instance, strip mining the oceans to produce minerals for electric cars without thinking about the consequences. We might condemn many in the poorer parts of the world to even more poverty because we will not allow their countries to develop or produce food in ways they may need to. We might end up, as wealthy entrepreneurs are already saying, indeed I was noted that someone working for Jeff Bezos came up with this argument about his spaceship, saying, well, it will be a brilliant solution to the climate crisis because it will enable people to go and live on another planet. And I'm thinking, yes, which people are going to go and live on another planet? I suspect ones with a lot of money, while the rest of us are left to live with the planet that they've destroyed in the process. And indeed, actually, I'm wary of over-technological solutions to environmental problems. Technology is good and really helps us, but if the root problem is actually selfishness, greed, and apathy, the danger is we looked at technology as an excuse not to tackle the real issue, which is how we live and how we relate to our environment and each other. So what we desperately need is a holistic approach to the climate crisis. We need a wider understanding of how issues are related to each other so we can make intelligent decisions. We need to support sustainable development that is not dependent on fossil fuels and help poorer nations and poorer people in ways that do not replicate the way we have developed and done so much damage, but still allow them to properly develop and properly increase their own lifestyles in a way that's sustainable. We need a global food policy that recognizes things about local contexts and local production. That inevitably means there will be some international food trade. But we then have to think about how we do that with minimal impact. And of course, that's where technology may help us in enabling non-carbon ways of transporting food. We need a recognition, I said, that the problem isn't primarily about technology, as that scientist realized. It's primarily about changing people. We need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And quite frankly, if the church is not at the forefront of enabling a spiritual and cultural transformation, what on earth are we here for? This seems to me to be the heart of what at its best the Christian gospel has to offer: spiritual and cultural transformation. Perhaps sometimes we have not been as good at it as we might have been, and we are playing therefore our part in the problems the world faces. And I think here there's a vision for mission that I refer to as intercultural, and this quote from Vincent Donovan, who did mission amongst the Maasai in Africa, and learnt a lot of lessons about how not to do it and therefore how to do it in the process. So this is a quote from his book, Christianity Rediscovered. Do not call them back to where they were, and do not try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place may seem to you. You have to have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have been before. And the quote should come in there, but it won't. I've obviously got my PowerPoint slide wrong there, but that's all right. We all make mistakes. And the reason he discovered this is because what he realized was he knew how to be a Christian in New York, where he came from, but he didn't know how to be a Christian amongst the Maasai in Africa, where he was. But the Maasai weren't Christian, so they didn't know either how to be Christians as Maasai. So they had to go on a journey together to discover what that meant. And I think this is at the heart of the way we do mission. Mission with each other in our different cultures, but actually mission in relation to the planet we share. So what might it mean to travel not just with people, but with all creation to discover together the world we need to build? And Nigel Rooms, who was a missionary for a while in Tanzania before he came out to this country, talks about mission as the process by which the church is converted. And he cites the story of Cornelius in Acts 10 being met by Peter and says, which one of them had the bigger conversion? And he says it was Peter who got converted far more than Cornelius did by the encounter. And then again, this thing of engaging with indigenization. One of the questions that really rolls around my mind is, what might it mean to re-indigenize Christianity in a country like Britain? What might that mean? To re-engage with the soil and the seasons and the landscape. I was been very fortunate over the years to spend time with some First Nation peoples groups in different contexts. Firstly, I connected up with a Methodist mission in Estonia that was working with Finno-Ugric tribes people across the Russian borders. And when they were converted, they were told they weren't allowed to use their language or culture. And what this Methodist mission was doing was reintroducing their language and culture into faith so they could express faith within their context. I've then also met with First Nation Americans doing exactly the same thing, reintegrating their faith with their cultural history and its relationship with the land. And the same with Aboriginal Christians in Australia. These are some rather nice books. This is by a major thinker in First Nation American theology, Richard Twiss, One Church, Many Tribes. And this next one has one of my favourite titles of any book ever, Saving the Gospel from the Cowboys. I think we could do with saving the gospel from the cowboys in many walks in life. Some similar things in Aboriginal thinking. So this is creation and rainbow spirit theology from Aboriginal First Nation Christians. And a strong emphasis in these traditions of how you live in relationship with the land and those you share the land with, that I think we've got to really think, what would that mean for us as British people to recover that kind of relational way of living? And I think there's an enormous lack of indigenous spirituality in the Western Church. We've come a long way from that kind of experience that might have been part of the early church in our context. And I think with this, there's a loss of British and English identity. I think there's a real identity crisis in England. And partly I think that's because for a long time our identity was wound up with our colonialism. And the loss of colonialism is that it loses English identity, so that the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh know who they are, but the English don't. What might a re-indigenized English Christian identity look like? You remember that image earlier I had of Christianity as saving humans from the world? Well, I do a little thought exercise, and I'm going to give you a snippet of it here, because we don't have time to do the whole thing, in which I think of this in terms of a mathematical set. Do not glaze over. You can think of a mathematical set as a kind of way of thinking, how do you decide the boundaries to something? So I think that kind of model of conversion is what I call a bounded set approach. The question you ask is, are you in or are you out? And evangelism becomes the process of getting the people who are out in, where they're safe and protected from the world out there, which is very bad. And I have a feeling that this is often the underlying assumption not examined in much of our language of mission and evangelism. It's about people getting in. I think it's why, for instance, we get obsessed with counting numbers in church as the sign of mission, because we want to know who's in. But might there be another way of thinking about it? I think of it actually more as a transformational process. The idea of, Jesus talks about the yeast that gets into the dough and leavens the whole thing. As rather than a getting people in, more a case of getting out and being transformative. I've used here some images from a CMS, and others have used it as well, a picture thing called The Christ We Share, where they depict Christ from different cultural contexts around the world in very different ways. So Christ becomes at home in the context and from within transforms it. And I've added that last one of Jesus the Druid in a contemporary sort of British context perhaps. Indeed, Columba referred to Jesus as his Druid. And I think of this as what I call a centered set approach, where the question is not are you in or are you out, but which way are you going and how much further have you got to go? And the goal is not joining the church or becoming a Christian, The ultimate goal is being transformed into the likeness of Christ, so we are the people we are called to be in all our fullness. And indeed, we will live then as blessings to others in the planet we live within. I find this an attractive way of thinking for a number of reasons, because there are a number of implications for this. Firstly, evangelism and discipleship become part of the same process. We become lifelong people being converted into the likeness of Christ, rather than stepping over a line and feeling that the job's been done. Also, we are all still on the journey. We need each other to encourage each other, to help us grow in faith, to continually evangelize each other. And that point of turning, for some people it's a very sudden thing. You know the kind of story of the terrible prisoner who finds God in prison and their life is totally turned around. For other people it's a very slow process where they turn through little degrees. And what they would say is, I'm really not quite sure when I started to follow Christ. I just know that I didn't 5 years ago and now I do. And the reality also is, as we get near the centre, we realise we still have a bit of turning to do as we become more and more clear about Christ's demands on our lives. So I just commend that to you as a way perhaps of rethinking what we're doing in mission, evangelism, conversion and discipleship. So, a spiritual and cultural conversion. What should our kingdom home, oikos, look like? What is our vision for it? Because actually, if we can start to describe what we think it will look like, that is a powerful message to convey. One of the problems the environmental movement faces is it's often telling you what's not good. It's really difficult to get the image of what it should be like. And I think that's something we can imagine in Christ. How should its economy, or economia, be run? How will we work with those we share the inhabited world, the oikoumene, with? And you notice there's a theme here. All these important things about our world come from that Greek word oikos, home. What is our home to be like, lived with all those we share it with? What will our kingdom ecology, oikologia, look like? And these things are all interlinked. Home, economy, relationship, ecology. What needs to change in these areas for this to happen? And one of the things you may want to think about when we stop for our next discussion, reflection thing before we come to questions is, what would your local community look like if it were transformed into the home that God imagines? What would it look like in your local community? And how might that happen? And how will this affect us as we speak of the gospel of the kingdom in terms of this? What will we say to people? What will be the invitation we give to follow Christ in the light of this thinking? What kind of church will witness to this and live it out? One of the things I'm involved in the diocese is known as Forest Church, and this is partly a way of re-engaging our worshipping life with the seasons and the soil. Not taking church outdoors, but worshipping with creation and allowing its rhythms to speak into our rhythms. And part of my vision is to help forest churches spring up across the diocese as hubs of community where we can have a missional, ecological Christian community. And a map of the diocese kind of showing some things that occurred to me as I was looking at the situation. Various places where there are groups like Extinction Rebellion groups or Friends of the Earth groups. Various places where there are sort of things like sacred wells. Various places where there are things like people exploring nature spirituality outside the church. and how we might connect with those communities as Christians. And hoping that we might plant forest churches across the diocese to connect. And there are a number growing up. They're growing up all the time. So I've been involved in helping Forest Church start right up in the north of the diocese, North Staffordshire, right out in the west. We're exploring some things down in the Black Country, sort of in Lichfield, in Cannock Chase, various places. And it might be something from your communities you might be interested in exploring, and I'd be happy to explore that with you and the wider vision that works with it. So I want to finish this talk by just giving an idea of what evangelism is in the kind of world we need to live in ecologically. It's not about getting people to church, but getting people to be church. Not taking God to people, but seeing what God is doing in people's lives and enabling that to come to fruition. Not about getting people into heaven, but getting heaven into people. Not about saving people from the world, but transforming them as part of God's plan to transform the world also. And it's not just about what happens to human people, but also enabling and sharing this paradise with the non-human people we share it with. And you might sum this up in the phrase, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Okay, I'm going to stop there. Ooh, we're pretty much good, bang on time, that's good. Okay, the idea is that you might want to have now about sort of 5 to 10 minutes just talking amongst yourself, or you might want to sit and reflect on that suggestion I made of what would your community look like if it were transformed into the kingdom of God. And then we'll have some time for some questions. This is just to give you a 2-minute warning that we'll go into questions in about 2 minutes. Okay, folks. Now we have my glamorous assistant Joe, who has a roving mic and can go around and find people with questions. And I think the easiest thing is, if you've got a question, stick your hand up, and then Joe can come and find you with the mic, and we'll hear your question. So, over to you.
Test this works. Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just interested to know, what is a forest church?
A false church?
No, a forest.
Oh, a forest church. Thank you. Thank you. You have to forgive me. I'm an awful southerner, and I don't necessarily understand people's accents. Oh. I know. Okay. A forest church. Firstly, I mean, just a little bit of backstory. I mentioned earlier that I've done mission work in New Age and pagan contexts for a number of years, and I run a network of people who do that kind of work. And we've been musing for a number of years about what kind of church would the people we work with want to be part of if they wanted to be part of a church. And we reckoned it had to be a church that met outside and connected with nature. And someone was then talking about forest schools, which has become a growing phenomenon in our school system, where kids learn outside in nature. And we thought, well, actually, we want to do something like that. So we'll do a forest church. So back in 2012, that was how Forest Church was born as a movement. Forest churches happen in different ways. There's no kind of set pattern. So there isn't a kind of like a Forest Church rule book or a Forest Church worship order that everyone follows. So it's very much down to people on the ground. So the forest churches I've run tend to follow this kind of pattern. We meet on seasonal events, so often all equinoxes and solstices, changing seasons. So at the moment we're in the harvest season, so you might meet at the 1st of August for Loaf Mass, Lammas, at the start of the harvest, celebrate the grain harvest, and then you meet at the end of October for All Hallows and the apple harvest, and you do this, and in the middle you do the autumn equinox, which is what we've just been doing, where you think about the balance of light and dark as we head into the dark half of the year. And what you're often doing then is thinking of the ancient themes in the year, which are woven often into the stories of the saints. So the Christmas story is linked by the early church with the equinoxes and solstices. So, and in the early church calendar, which was an older calendar than ours, all those dates fell on the 25th of the month. So on the 25th of March, you'd have celebrated the spring equinox. Now that is actually the Feast of the Annunciation. It's when Gabriel goes to Mary to say the Christ is to be born. And that, of course, means that 9 months later, at the winter solstice on the 25th of December, Jesus is born. And then John the Baptist is 6 months prior to Jesus. So at the autumn equinox, you get the Annunciation of John the Baptist, and he's born at midsummer. So you've got the equinoxes and solstices tied into the Christmas story. But there are other events similar to that. So we're partly reviving old customs and events, and then we often like to revive old craft activities or do crafts and things. So often the start of a forest church will meet, we'll have seasonal food and drink. So if I'm doing something, for instance, around All Hallows, it's the apple harvest and it's cold. So we'll have a fire and we'll probably have some mulled cider or something like that to drink, nice and warming, or mulled apple juice for those driving cars that don't want to drink. But we do seasonal food and drink, and we do craft activities. Now actually we play apple games. And indeed that's the origin of apple games at Halloween. It's all to do with the harvest traditions that got sort of turned into other things. And so partly you're reclaiming these seasonal events. And then we'd have a kind of what I would describe as a folky, Celtic-y kind of worship outdoors with some singing and some ritual actions and things like that. And then a bit more food and drink. So that's kind of the kind of stuff we do. Next question.
Lots of churches, including the one I go to, use Alpha as their main evangelism, which is very much about getting people into the circle. So have you got any ways of developing Alpha along the lines you've been talking about tonight?
I think, a number of comments. I think it's very interesting that Alpha was designed as a discipleship course, and what they found was that actually you could introduce people into Alpha who weren't signed up Christians. They tend to find it works quite well with people who have a church background, less well with people who don't have a church background. So I think, you see, firstly, you could imagine almost a forest church Alpha, where actually you did your discipleship thinking about the seasons and nature. So actually, you see, in a sense, if someone comes along to forest church activities, they're actually being taught the essence of the Christian faith because it's wound into the seasons and how we live them. I think also Alpha's very, very interesting. The place most people come to faith on the Alpha course is not the week where the atonement is explained. It's actually the Holy Spirit weekend. And the reason is because we live in a culture where actually the primary thing that impacts people is experience of God. So how then might we enable people to experience God in other contexts? I think is a key question. How might we, for instance, I think it's one of the reasons that things like healing on the streets work well. Because you go out onto the streets and you take that experience of God to people. It's what we're doing when I help Christians run churches in stalls in Mind, Body, Spirit fairs and stuff like that. We want people to experience God and find that God is real and that God can do stuff in our lives. And then you have to add, I think, teaching with that to enable people to understand that experience. So in a sense, Alpha's a bit topsy-turvy. It does the teaching and then the experience. And I would probably want to do the experience and then the teaching. Yep, but good question. Another question? They've all gone silent.
Last chance? Oh, valiant.
Steve, we were talking in our little group about the complexity of creation. In other words, we're just one person, but inside of us is a billion single-celled creatures, and then there's parasites, there's pandemics like we're living through at the moment. Do you think this is something that's gone wrong with creation because of our abuse of it? Or was this what God intended in the first place? Do you have a view?
Yes, and it's complex. Yeah, but I will unpick. I think there are three things going on here. One is that it seems clear to me that God's plan in creation is about the interrelationship of complex processes. So I think complexity of itself is part of God's plan. And indeed, it's healthy. One of the things we know that creation teaches us is diversity is phenomenally healthy. And I think it's very interesting when you think about Paul teaching about the body of Christ and how we want to sort of lop off the limbs we don't understand. And I think as humans, we have a reaction against complexity. We like simplicity. But I think God likes complexity, and he likes us to live with the diverse. But then, I think there is a thing of how we have failed to live with creation, and I'll bring another thought in a bit. How we fail to live with creation damages the way that complexity works. And I found it very revelationary when an evolutionary scientist was asked a question about the survival of the fittest. And he said, no, that's a total misunderstanding of the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is based on the survival of the adaptive, not the fittest. It's the ability to adapt that is that thing that is built into creation, I believe, from God. God designed us so we can change, so we can survive. And what we could have is an interconnected world in which species aid each other through their interrelations. Rather like, those fish, that little fish that clean sharks' teeth and things like that they don't eat because they know they're good for them. And that could be I think that's the kind of vision God has for the complexity of our world. A world of complex interrelation that produces harmony, life and growth, rather than destruction and death. And I think partly our failure to live up to our calling is responsible for that. Now, I think Scripture offers us another answer that works with that, and we're back into chaos monsters in the sea. I think it's very, very interesting that the idea of the chaos monster, Leviathan, develops throughout the Old Testament. So we start off with this chaos monster at creation. And then it's almost as if the Jewish writers are having a debate about the place of chaos in creation. And for some, the sea monster is God's. So there's a psalm that talks about God making Leviathan to sport in the waters for his delight. Doesn't sound very dangerous at all. Then there are others, and I think Psalm 74 that I shared with you earlier suggests that God has destroyed the chaos monster. But there are other passages which say that God is still in conflict with the chaos monster. So Isaiah 27, for instance, talks about the day of the Lord when God will finally defeat the serpent in the sea, and there will be no more death and suffering. It's why in the book of Revelation, we see in Revelation 13, a seven-headed dragon emerging out of the waters. It's this imagery again, who is finally defeated. And it's why you get this odd phrase in Revelation 21, that there was a new heaven and a new earth, and the former things have passed away, and there was no more sea. Because it's saying that the dwelling place of the chaos monster is no more in creation. I think it's also why in Job 31, God's final answer to Job when he's debating with God, why am I suffering unjustly? He says to him, Leviathan, can you fight Leviathan? Can you get hold of him? Can you chain him? You certainly can't. And Leviathan is used as God's explanation to Job of the place of suffering and chaos and destruction in the world. Now, again, this rebounds back to our call in Genesis to subdue the chaos. And partly the problem is our failure to live up to our calling. But that enables the destruction to run rife and cause chaos and suffering in the world. But God's promise is the renewed creation in which that is no more. And therefore there is no more suffering and no more death. But it will still be a complex world. It will just be a complex world in which the complexity is beneficial and not harmful. So a complex answer to a good question. Anybody else? That's absolutely fine if you don't.
If there's no more questions, then that will draw our evening to a close. On behalf of everybody, I'd like to say thank you to Steve for coming and sharing with us all of this fantastic insight this evening. So thank you very much, Steve. And also, I'd like to thank all of you for attending from your various churches and communities in the area. I do hope that your discussions have been fruitful and that they can go on to produce further fruit in your churches and your communities. And if things do develop, I'd personally love to hear about it. You can email me. I'm a curate at stmatthewswalsall.co.uk, and I'd love to hear just what kind of conversations you've been having this evening. We're going to start wrapping up now, but the stalls over to the side are still open for the next few minutes, so you can get over there and make all of your final purchases, but that will be it for this evening. So once again, thank you all very much.